Hello and welcome to our Zoom 201 training, how to use Zoom webinar or meeting from the host perspective. If you haven't already got a chance to watch our Zoom 101, that was the attendee experience. So if you wanted to learn kind of the nuts and bolts of how to attend a Zoom webinar or Zoom meeting, we encourage you to check out the 101 training. This is going to be a bit more in depth on how to host and create invites and run a Zoom webinar or Zoom meeting. So before we get started, I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Jason Berquist, and I'm the Affiliate Services Coordinator for WASAC.
And I'm Mitch Netzer. I'm the Communications Manager at WASAC also.
Perfect. So on screen, everybody should see the document that says Zoom 201 hosting. We will be posting these documents on the WASAC website in addition to the recording, so you'll have access to both materials. And in there, we'll make sure to include our contact information, or you can always email info@wasac.org. If you have any questions or want any further training, Mitch and I are always available to jump on and help people. So we'll go ahead and start on the document, step one.
All right. Well, so like Jason said, this document will be available after this. And we're actually going to spend less time in this document, and we're going to spend more time setting up a Zoom meeting live on the website. So we're going to show that. But first, it's important to note there is a difference between Zoom meetings and Zoom webinars. Zoom meetings are a little bit more open and free-flowing. They're not as locked down, where attendees can unmute themselves at any point or request to share their screen and all that sort of thing. Whereas with a webinar, a Zoom webinar, it's a little bit more locked down, where you as the host need to grant permission to the attendees to be able to unmute themselves. And also the other really big difference with that, with a meeting to a webinar, is that the webinar has the question and answer panel, the Q&A panel, so that you can do more formal Q&A time, versus the Zoom meeting only has a chat panel. So it's a little less formal Q&A if you are going to try and do that in a meeting. But the webinar does also have the chat panel, but we can get into all that later. So with that, you need to first have a Zoom account, and that is found at zoom.us. And currently, Zoom offers free accounts that can host meetings up to 40 minutes, and you will be cut off at that 40-minute mark at about 10 minutes. It gives you a notification pop-up with a timer that counts down from that 10 minutes, and once it hits 0, everyone will be booted from the meeting. So you need to either ensure that your meetings are fast, or you need to make sure that you pay for an account. And there's 2 different accounts that work very well. One is a pro for $14.99 a month, and one is a business account for $19.99 a month. And if you go to zoom.us and look at their subscriptions services, you can see the little variations between those 2. So we are going to jump over to zoom.us real quick so that we can see it. So first thing first is you have your profile, meetings, webinars, personal audio conferences. Some of these may or may not be active for you, depending on the service that you purchase, but here they are.
And this is the view you would see when you log into your account, just to clarify.
Yes.
So once you've either logged into your county account or you created one, this is what you would see when you initially sign in.
Correct. So if you do record a meeting or webinar, your recordings will be found under recordings. You can do some more global settings for all of your meetings and things like that under settings. And then if you are an admin for a large group, say for your entire county, and all of your email domains are connected to your account, you can find the control of all of that under your admin settings. But we're not going to get into that because that's more Zoom 301 type thing. So first things first, we will schedule a new meeting. So if you click on your meetings and you go schedule a new meeting, you can, you are now creating your meeting. So we will walk through this, test meeting. You can add your description here. And you can choose your date and time if you would like. So we could say Friday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, not morning. And then you set your duration. Some people worry that if they set it for an hour, what happens if I go an hour and a half or an hour and 15? It's okay, that's not going to boot you off. It's more likely that Zoom uses this to reserve their server space and bandwidth, and just kind of monitor of what they can expect on that day. If you do have a recurring meeting, if this is going to be a recurring meeting every Friday at 2 o'clock, you can click that. You can change it to daily, weekly, monthly, no fixed time. So you can repeat, set your repeat there, your end date, or your number of occurrences. So if you say you want it to end after 7 or however many you'd like, up to 20, you can set that there. So if you would like registration, we at WASAC require your first and last name and your email address, and I believe we ask for your title too, just so that we can get an idea of who is registering for our online events. We always do generate automatically for a meeting ID. You can just set it to your own ID if you'd like, but not required. Meeting password, we require passwords just for an added step of security. So when people click on your link invite, they aren't just brought immediately in, but they will also have to put in the password just in case that link is shared. But that again is personal preference. Host video on and off for when they first join. You can always change this on the fly and allow it, but it's kind of nice to not have it automatically start right when you join too and take someone by surprise. We always do, with audio, we always do both to allow people to use their phones to dial in to connect their audio, or they can use computer audio. I use computer audio. I know, Jason, you tend to have to use your phone audio because you live in a more rural area, so you don't have as stable of a connection. So it's good to have an offer. What was that?
That is true.
That is true. So it's good to have that option and offer it to people. And you know, sometimes you may live in a great area with a very strong internet connection, but you never know because it can change day to day and have some issues. So with meeting options going down, you can enable that join before host. So if you're pretty relaxed about things and you want your attendees to be able to just meet and chat before you get in there, say there's some early people, they can get in there and be hanging out before you. We generally don't do that so that we can maintain a little bit more control and formality. We also like to mute participants upon entry just in case they join and don't realize that their computer's unmuted or something like that. So we make sure that they join muted and have to unmute themselves. Enabling a waiting room, that gives you the option to, when you start, say Jason and I are hosting this meeting and all the participants are going to be joining, but Jason and I want to chat beforehand, before everyone gets in there, and we kind of want to talk about, you know, our plan for the agenda and kind of nail down some final details. We could enable that waiting room, and what that would do is anyone who joins, all the attendees who join would be put into a waiting room, and they're not able to talk to each other or anything like that. It's just a little pop-up on their screen when they go to join saying that they're in the waiting room for the title and description of the meeting, and they'll be admitted by the host at the time of the meeting. So when it starts, and then a great feature about that, if you're doing interviews or meetings where you want to go into an executive session or something like that, what's great about that is if you're doing an interview, you can have, you can be interviewing someone, you can use the same link for all your interviews that day, and you can send out that link and say your time is at 1 o'clock, your time's at 2 o'clock, and that way you, if an interviewee shows up early, they aren't overhearing or listening in to the other person being interviewed. So when that interview is done, you can either remove them completely from the meeting, or you can put them back out into the waiting room to bring back later if you'd like, and then admit the next person you're going to interview. It's also a useful feature if you're going into executive session. So you can move all the attendees that should not be a part of that executive session into the waiting room, and notify them that it's going to be a 45-minute executive session or however long, and then they will be brought back in at that time. And then you can just, again, move them all back out of the waiting room into the regular meeting. So it's a great, useful feature.
And just one note, so if you choose to enable that as the host, it's very important that you keep an eye on that within the Zoom, because it's very easy to get, once you get going, to forget that there's a waiting room enabled. So maybe somebody joins 15 minutes late, they don't automatically get put into the Zoom, so they're waiting in the waiting room. So they may have to text you or message you and let you know that they're waiting. So it's very important that if you opt to use the enabling of the waiting room feature, it's very easy at the very beginning to know to let everybody in, but you have to keep an eye on that. And there's a notification in the toolbar. It usually pops up and lets you know that someone's in the waiting room, but just be mindful of that. That's the one caveat with that.
Yes, thank you. So we like to use waiting room, but yes, you need to be aware that you need to keep an eye on it. Authenticated users, that means they have to have an account through Zoom. We generally don't do that because we don't want to force people to have to create an account if they, a lot of people who join a meeting or a webinar just join the minute before or 5 minutes into, and you don't want to put another block to them getting in where they have to create an account first. If you're hosting a meeting where you'd like to have breakout rooms, here's where you can do that. You can assign a breakout room. You can create the breakout room. So you can set your rooms, and you could add Jason to that room. You could add a whole, 2, 3, 4 people to that room. You could then create other rooms and go through and edit those. You can also import from a CSV file from Excel. If you have that, that's a little bit more advanced. We're not going to get into that today, but if you've done mail merge with Outlook or something like that, that's very similar. You can you can also, sorry, jump past this. You can record the meeting automatically. So as soon as the meeting is launched, it will start recording. We do not do that because we like to have a little chat beforehand and kind of get things going, and then press record when we're really ready to officially kick off the meeting or webinar. You just got to remember to actually press record. That's the only caveat with that. You can here designate alternative hosts. So if Jason and I are hosting one of these Zoom trainings, if he just sends me the link, I'm just going to come in as an attendee. Or if he designates my email address as a host here and saves it, I'll be notified through email. And then when I click that link that I got through notification, when I join this meeting, I'll be designated as a host by Zoom. Let's see, I think we got it all through here. So we'll schedule that. And then, so now once you've scheduled your meeting, you can always edit the details. You'll see a line of your meetings along the meetings thing. And if you want to edit it, sorry, I gotta move my window here. Here's where you can start your meeting. You can delete it. Or again, if you need to edit the details of your meeting, you can go in here, you can add it to your Outlook or your other calendars. You can get your meeting password or ID. Here's where you can copy and paste the invite link to send it to people, or you can open your invitation and get a whole official Zoom invite, which also includes the password.
And that's how, like Mitch was just saying, you can copy that meeting invitation and put it directly into an email or Outlook invite that you plan to send out. That way, all the details they need are right there in one spot. So.
Exactly. So you can go in and edit this meeting if you would like. We would not like to. But if you would like to create a poll for the meeting, here's where you would do that. You have not created a poll, so we can go add. So if you're wanting to do an official question throughout this, we can just enter the poll name. So we know when we're sharing our slide deck that our first poll is on slide 5. So we'll say slide 5 poll. You can choose to have the responses anonymous or not. We're not going to. What is your favorite color? So we can do green, green, I guess not green. So my favorite color is green, so people don't have much of a choice.
I can tell.
You can choose then to delete it, or you can add another one and hit save. And here's your first poll, and there will be a polls button at the bottom of your Zoom webinar or meeting interface. And when you click on that polls tab, it'll pull up the whole list of all the polls that you've preset. You can also add polls during the meeting if you say you forgot one or you want to do one on the fly. You can do it there. So you can then launch the meeting from here too. And this is generally how I like to launch my meetings. Some people like to have the invite in their Outlook calendar and they click the link from there while they're logged in. I like to make sure that, yes, I am in fact logged into the account that I'm wanting to host the meeting from, and then go to my meeting and start it from there, just so I'm doubly sure. The same thing goes for webinars. Same thing, we don't have webinars on this account, on my personal WASAC account, but we do have meetings. One thing you need to be aware of, especially if you have meetings and webinars enabled on that account, is that though it'll let you schedule meetings, say I have a meeting for tomorrow at 2 o'clock, I can schedule a webinar for tomorrow at 2 o'clock, but I cannot run them both at the same time. You may only do one webinar at a time and one meeting at a time, only one thing at a time. So make sure to leave yourself plenty of time and space. Sometimes these run over. Zoom meetings and webinars tend to run over the clock slightly a little bit with a lot of times when you're doing Q&A. So give yourself that little bit of leeway. Or you may need a second account too at times. So we will jump
Back to the
over.
document. I wanted to hit on something earlier that Mitch had said. So I know some people get confused between the difference between meetings and webinars in Zoom. Because basically there's two categories. There's either a Zoom meeting or a Zoom webinar. Here at WASAC, we traditionally use the webinar format when it's more information we're trying to share out. So it could be, it's a very large group and you're having one speaker and you want to basically share out a lot of information. You don't want as much input or very limited from the attendees. That's a great format because you lock down, everybody is automatically muted. They have to ask permission to raise their hand to speak. They have to submit questions through the Q&A box or through the chat box. So you as a host have way more control over the dialogue, versus the meeting format is great for staff meetings, more informal meetings where you want to have a lot more engagement, because the attendees, unlike the webinar format, in the meeting format, they're able to mute and unmute themselves. There is no Q&A box, but there is the chat box, and so there's a lot of opportunity to kind of engage. So those are the two biggest things I just want to make sure that people are clear when they're trying to figure out, should I schedule it as a Zoom meeting or a Zoom webinar? We've used them both interchangeably, but depending on the purpose of your meeting. So for example, like a board meeting, that might be better to have in a Zoom webinar format, especially if there's a lot of attendees. That way you can kind of control who gets to speak and when, especially if someone has to take notes or there's action by the board. The great thing about, as Mitch talked about, some of the breakout rooms is you can use those for executive session. You can kind of, if it's a long, 3-4 hour webinar that you're having or meeting, it's a great opportunity to be able to stop and break people up. We used it for a staff training, so we were all together for an hour, and then we broke up into smaller rooms for a half an hour to do some networking and training, and then we came back into a larger space. But the biggest two things is just the ability to mute and unmute yourself is very different between a webinar and a meeting, and then the Q&A box is the bigger difference. So those are the most important. If you get anything out of what the difference is between the two, is just understanding that concept. So I think we covered step 1 and step 2.
Yep.
And you did a great job, by the way, Mitch.
Thank you.
If I say so myself. So step 3, I know people are always wondering how to share screens, how to give remote control. So those are things we can kind of talk you through right now.
Yep. So, okay, we did step 3 with the start the meeting and launching it. So running your meeting or webinar. So here is what the controls look like at the bottom of your Zoom meeting. I believe this is Zoom webinar because I don't think meeting has reactions. I don't believe so. So recording, very simple, is right here, that little record button. You can start and stop it right there. If you're sharing content, it then moves to the top of your screen, but that is where you start the record button.
And as an attendee, their bar at the bottom will look slightly different than as the host. Obviously, the host, you have a lot more features. So I think the bar we're showing for the most part is the host perspective. So as an attendee in a webinar, for example, they have an opportunity to raise their hand, to mute and to turn on their volume or to turn on their video, and then some of the reaction stuff as well. But a lot of these other ones are what you would see as the host when you're in your account. So
correct. So let's see, muting and unmuting. You can unmute your participants by clicking on the Participants tab, and that will open up a window with all of your participants. Obviously, when I took this screenshot, there's only me in there, but it'll have a total number of your participants. You may mute and unmute them here, or yourself if you would like. And then for more options, you can click that more. And in a webinar, that's where you would say allow to talk or allow to share, or you could even make them a host or presenter of the meeting there.
And you can also use rename folks too. Sometimes people will use the same link that they share and they forget to change when they log in, to change their credentials. So then 2 people will show up with the same name. You as a host can during the webinar, click on the more next to their name, and then there's an option to rename. I was also going to mention that, so in the webinar format, you can allow them to talk. You can control who gets to talk, but sometimes the attendees also will need to unmute themselves. Is one thing we've discovered in the webinar, is that we unmute them, but then we still don't hear them, so then we have to remind them to unmute themselves. They may have muted their laptop or muted their speaker, so just something to keep in mind.
Yep. And they also may, if they're dialed in through their phone, sometimes the phone has a mute there too.
Yeah.
Let's see. Okay, so sharing your content is in the center of the band at the bottom. Share screen generally. So you can hit that green share button and it will open up a window. And if you have a lot of things open or a lot of monitors, it can be kind of overwhelming, especially because you can end up scrolling this. Here's where you can share either a single monitor, or you can share a program or a single window from a program if you'd like.
Or a document.
A document, yeah. Here, if you plug in your iPhone or iPad, you can connect it there and share that screen too. So if you're wanting to show off an app or a mobile website, that can be a great function of that too. Under advanced, you can share just a snippet of your screen if you'd like, a couple other options in there, or you can choose to share specific files with your attendees.
And once you've clicked on which document or screen that you want to share, it should turn blue like the picture that Mitch has on screen. That way you know you're correctly sharing the right one. You don't want to inadvertently share the wrong thing. But you should be able to see it as the host, because the moment you hit share in the bottom right-hand corner, once you think you know what you want, it'll show up on screen. So you'll see it at the same time as your attendees. So.
All right. So once you do start sharing, like I said, it moves those controls that are normally at the bottom of your screen up to the top. And they may have hidden all of these buttons and you just see a green and a red button. If you scroll over that, all these should pop up there. Like this is all I'm seeing right now on my screen is these green and red buttons. And your chat log and a couple other things to start and stop and pause recording is all under the more section too. So it kind of hides some things around on you a little bit, but
and before you scroll, Mitch, for a second. So as a host, you oftentimes you will be the one who has all the documents on screen that you'll be sharing. Sometimes you'll have a fellow panelist or an attendee that at some point during the Zoom they need to share documents. So they have the option of requesting to share their screen. So for example, Mitch and I are at 2 different locations, and I might be running the meeting. He's an attendee. He has the option of clicking on the share screen button. It notifies me as the host that Mitch wants to share his screen. I grant permission. Then suddenly his screen gets shared with everyone. At any point that I want to take the screen back as the host, you can end the sharing, or he will end it on his end as well. I was also going to note that on the picture you'll see there's a remote control option. So some people find it easier if they have one person who controls all the documents on their computer. You can do that, but then grant someone control. So I could have the PowerPoint presentation up on my computer as the host. Someone else is on a different location, but when it comes time to them to present, they're going to use certain slides that are in my presentation or a document that I have that's theirs. I can click the remote control button. It'll list everyone that's in that meeting or that's listed as a panelist or a host, and then I can let them have control, and they remotely can have control over the mouse to click through the document, even though they're not even on my computer. It's a remote thing, so that's kind of a cool feature. So there's definitely cool ways. It's important, I would encourage you, before you have a meeting, if you're not truly feeling confident about it, is to practice with someone and use the share screen option, use the remote control option, because you'll feel more and more confident the more you practice, but it's really intuitive once you kind of start learning how to do it. So I just want to make sure we covered those 2 things.
Yeah, that's good. Annotate up there is very cool too. If you're wanting to show off a website or a document or something like that, you can circle on your screen. It's kind of like a little bit of a strip down, well, not strip down, but it's basically like a Microsoft Paint that you can do right on your screen. And you can save all those images. You can type right on there, and you can save it all afterwards too. So you can kind of, if you are discussing a website remake or what you want to do with a document, you could annotate your screen. Everyone's happy with it. You can save that for later too. So a great way of doing it. That pause share button is also very nice and handy if you notice you have an error on a document or a PowerPoint presentation. Say you notice this typo that you want to fix real quick, you could hit that pause share button, close your PowerPoint presentation, edit it, relaunch it, and hit share or start share again, and it would just quick change, and no one would see you making that change. So it's a kind of a nice thing if you need to do some stuff on your screen that you're sharing, but you just want to pause it, and you can do some stuff, come back and unpause, and no one will see any changes. So that's really it for Zoom 201 with the using the whole interface. We have some tips for you for running a smooth meeting or webinar. Jason mentioned before, actually just doing a couple test runs and playing around with the software and making sure that you're a little more comfortable in it before you actually try and officially run a meeting or webinar. So that's a great way to do it. Use the chat box for general discussion when you're in a webinar. Use it for general discussion, and a Q&A box. Use the Q&A box for actual questions. Again, if you're doing a meeting, then you're going to have to do Q&A through the chat box also, since it does not have that Q&A feature. Utilize the raise hand icon, which in meetings is under the participants tab. In a webinar, it's right there at the bottom of the interface, which is handy. That way people can just raise their hand if they have a question, and you can simply just call on them rather than having multiple people talking over each other, especially in a larger meeting or webinar. If you unmute a participant, say in a webinar, they may still need to unmute themselves. So if you unmute them and say, hey, John, you're unmuted. Did you have a question? What was it? And you're not hearing anything, you can just say, hey, you might still have yourself muted. Make sure to hit that unmute button. The last thing that we have for you, which has helped us greatly in running a very smooth meeting, is to make sure you always get started on the right foot. So have a short welcome script explaining what's happening, what's going to happen, a little bit of the agenda. If it's recorded and the slides and the slide materials or supplemental material will be available. And then how you're going to be conducting Q&A, if you're going to take questions during, or if all questions are going to be answered at the end, or if you're not going to take Q&A. And then what they should do if it's in a meeting, use the chat box or raise your hand, or if it's in a webinar, use the Q&A or try and raise your hand too. And then we've also included a sample script for us, for you too. And that includes the big ol' red bolded record button. So you make sure to record it, press record if you want before you get going. Because I know I've done that before. I realize I haven't started recording and then you kind of cut off the beginning of it. So.
And something we covered in the Zoom 101 training video, so if you didn't watch that first, it's worth noting. You'll notice in the sample script towards the very bottom, there's a warning that please be aware that all chat logs, questions, and the webinar recording is considered a public record and will be available for download. Automatically, at the end of the webinar or meeting, an email goes to the host with a copy of the chat log. So it's very important you realize as the host to let your attendees know that even if they're having side conversations and using the chat box for maybe conversations about the speaker or other things, there's a copy of that that's made and emailed, therefore it becomes a public record. So people shouldn't be saying anything in those chat logs or amongst themselves that they don't want to be part of a public record. So just very important that you make sure people are aware of that every time that they're joining a webinar or meeting that you are hosting. So I don't know if there's any other things we didn't cover. I think we did a great job, if I say so myself. We have no feedback. So, but as we mentioned at the very beginning of this, if you have any additional questions or things that we didn't cover that you want to learn more about, we encourage you to use the info@wasac.org. That's a great resource if you want to submit questions or ask further comments. You can also get a hold of Mitch and I. We're always welcome to help people that want to maybe practice or just have more questions in depth about whether they want to learn about the webinar or meeting or hosting it or attending it. Please feel free to reach out to us. We're more than welcome to help. So thank you very much and have a wonderful day.